Scroll of Thoth, episode, see, I already messed it up. Hold on just a sec. 24, see.
It said 24, but I thought we were further along.
Forgot. Okay, one more time. Scroll of Thoth, episode 24, February 24th, 2015. Good evening.
Hi, guys.
Hello, everybody. Tonight we have a wonderful guest who is the host and producer of the best occult podcast, because it definitely surpasses ours. We have with us tonight Greg Kaminsky. Greg, how you doing?
Good. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the invitation. I'm an admirer of Scroll of Thoth podcast, so it's a thrill to be on.
Thank you.
And we didn't even have to pay him for that.
Let's jump right in, and why don't you just go ahead and let our listeners know what is a Cult of Personality?
Okay. Cult of Personality is a podcast I started about almost 10 years ago now, as I was interested in exploring the occult, the Western esoteric mysteries, ancient religion and symbolism. And I figured there were a lot of people whose opinions I thought highly of, who I would love the opportunity to chat with, but I very quickly realized that they had no incentive at all to talk to me. So the idea of a podcast very quickly was born, and I figured that would be a great way to have an opportunity to talk with all these people whose opinion I valued so highly, and also give them an incentive to have the conversation so we could share it with other people and promote their work, or at least allow time for their, to air their ideas in public, in a public forum in that way. So A Cult of Personality is available at occultofpersonality.net. There's over 150 episodes completed so far, and a pretty decent number are available on the website in the archives. We also have a membership section with older podcasts that have been archived, as well as exclusive member content, continuation of the free interviews, as well as some additional special content for members as well. So that's the way I really support the show, and that I'm able to continue doing it. So to all the people who subscribe to the Occult of Personality membership section, a huge thank you, and I salute you all, because you make it possible for the world to hear this show.
And I think it is a really important show, because, how you mentioned, you have that exchange of, you get to pick someone's brain, at the same time they get to promote themselves, and there's so few outlets really in the magical community for that kind of promotion.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. I wish there were more outlets for it, because there's way more people and more work to be promoted than I could certainly do myself. I always feel a little guilty when I tell people, I'm sorry, but I'm all booked up, or I just don't have room in the schedule, or maybe let's connect again like next year or later or whatever, because there's just so many great authors and teachers and researchers to talk to, and it's almost never ending.
Well, you can send a few of them our way.
Yeah,
I'd be happy to.
We had a while there that we were about 6 months booked up, but our schedule isn't crazy. So
Yet.
Yeah,
that could change very rapidly.
It could. I'm going to ask you my favorite question I ask everyone who comes on the show, because it's always such a revealing question that you learn from. How did you get interested in the occult?
Yeah, that's a great question. Just as an aside, are you getting any background noise from my side?
We got a little hum here.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on.
People banging around in the kitchen, but it's probably us.
Okay. So how did I get interested? I've always been interested in things like the Arthurian legends and the Grail stories. As a kid, I played Dungeons and Dragons. I think probably 3/4 of the time I was just totally lost in my own imagination. And as I got older, and I went to college and went to work after that, a lot of these things kind of slipped from my focus. And they were still interesting, but they didn't draw my attention the way they had in the past. And then in my early 30s, I went through, I wouldn't call it an existential crisis, but it kind of had aspects of that sort of experience where I began to question what I perceived as reality, and things didn't make any sense to me, and I started looking for answers. And it was not too long before I had basically circled back around and started discovering all these ideas within ancient mythology or the Grail legends, or generally in Western esotericism, about ways to approach this dark night of the soul and what this meant, and that it was really an opportunity for awakening into a more authentic way of life. And so I just dove right in because that's exactly what I was looking for. And when that world unfolded, it allowed transformation to occur. And that's really the main reason why I'm such a huge proponent of magic, mysticism, and any of these systems that allow for self-transformation.
Do you practice a particular system on your own?
Well, I'm a Freemason since 2010. I'm a member of another occult order, and my own personal practice is really what I would call like an inner alchemy type of practice, where it's solitary, and it involves ritual and meditation, and basically I would call it like a Western counterpart to Taoist yoga or Taoist alchemy.
So I'm going to go for the softball kind of thing. You mentioned Dungeons and Dragons.
Yes.
I actually have a long post about that on my website. The people who produce these games, because of the scare in the 80s, often go a long way to say Dungeons and Dragons has nothing to do with the occult. But I found that it was a stepping stone for me. Do you feel like the symbolism that you encountered there is what kind of attracted you, or was it the whole taking on another persona, or some kind of mix of both?
Yeah, I think it was definitely both. I really appreciated the way you could take on another persona, become someone else in an alternate reality or alternate world. I don't know if I'd call it a reality, but I think the other aspect to it that I appreciated so much was this. They included the idea of like a metaphysics in the game, you know, where your character had a certain alignment, so you had a certain ethos that you subscribed to, and then you had intelligent beings of different sorts and species, as well as magical beings and spirits. And I think the biggest thing is that the influences on the game obviously come from the real world, you know, even though that might be mythology and legend and lore. A lot of it is not made up whole cloth. So the influences, once you branch out from the game, can be found in religion, the history of religion, the symbolism of religions, and ancient civilizations, folklore, and mythology. And I think the game very much harkens back to a more ancient time, although certainly the portrayal of the monsters and the magic may be a little bit extravagant and exaggerated. But the ideas are there. It's certainly a framework to expose people to that way of thinking.
I found interesting going back and looking at it, especially in the older books, where like the system of different planes that it developed on its own that was like independent. Well, it was a mixture of different mythologies. It was almost as complex as some occult correspondence systems, some occult, planar systems that I've seen.
Yeah, and I have to also bring up this idea because one of the things I think they did brilliantly was include the different pantheons of deities from various systems in the game. So, you could have Norse deities and Mayan deities and, all kinds of gods and goddesses, and it didn't seem strange that they were all sort of inhabiting the same universe. So I thought that was kind of neat.
It also introduces you to an interesting question of, I have a character. Does your character worship a god? Choose a god. And something you never question when you're just growing up in a tradition is why? Why should I choose a god? And then
Yeah.
once you get that question, then you open just a huge kettle of fish.
Well, I think that's right, because then it's like, well, why do I have to choose just one god? And why do I have to be limited to just one pantheon? It may not make sense in a logical way in our world, but you're right. Once you start asking these questions, the rules around these things start to make less sense, I think.
Well, I've never played Dungeons and Dragons, so I don't have the background in that. But I do play some other role-playing games. But I guess where I was going to go with this is that for me, when we're talking about pantheons, the two biggest buddies that I see are Jesus and Anubis, and they really like to hang out together. And I rarely ever see Anubis without Jesus walking along beside him.
Fascinating.
Yeah, they have their correspondences.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to move away from my pet subject of role-playing games. Perhaps you can name for us some of maybe your top 5 interviews on a cult of personality. If you can do that, if you can choose them, what were some of your favorites?
Well, it's hard to pick favorites. I put so much into every interview, but there are definitely a few that stand out. Starting with the one you mentioned before we went on air, which is the Neville Drury interview. That one stands out because we spoke, I think it was less than a month before he passed, and I was so touched by the way he was at peace, and he didn't exhibit any of the fear or uncertainty or terror that most people who are approaching death, seem to display. He was very at ease. He was really ready to go, and it made a huge impression on me because in the esoteric traditions, one of the goals of the initiate is generally to master the fear of death, but so few actually accomplish that. And I'm not saying I have not, but so few have, as far as I'm aware. To meet someone that had was a real special thing, especially as he was so close.
And I would say it was the perfect match as far as interviews. I don't want to blow smoke up your ass or anything, but you are always so respectful to your guests
Oh,
and
thanks.
let them really tell their story that and you have a knack for kind of guiding them through the story and structuring it that is really amazing, and I think you did an excellent job with that with Neville. Maybe let our listeners know what was Neville's niche, what was his path, and why was he important?
Um, well, I, I I don't know. I didn't know Neville well while he was alive, and I was only like slightly familiar with his work. But he was an academic, but he had a real personal passion for the esoteric, particularly esoteric art, and he was a probably one of the foremost, if not the foremost, researcher of the work of Rosalie Norton, the Australian witch and devotee of Pan, as well as the English artist Austin Osman Spare. And his one of his last books was Dark Spirits, published by Salamander and Sons. That was a I don't know if it was really a comparison, but he really profiled Norton and Spare in the book, and the way in which the dark spirits sort of guided them in their artwork, and why that was important for Western esotericism. Um, but more generally, I think in the pagan community, especially in Australia, he was a very important figure because his work, and I don't think uh, esoteric traditions require any kind of legitimacy that they don't already have inherently. But to the outside world, um, Neville Drury, I think, brings or brought and continues even after his death to bring a level of insight and analysis to the esoteric that elevates the whole discussion about the subject, and places it in a context that more properly reflects its importance in the history of humanity. And I think for that reason alone, like, he has a special place in the afterlife, because he he elevated, I think, in many ways, esotericism, um, and the discussion about it, especially for those, I think, outside of, who weren't in the tradition themselves, who maybe were interested in it, who studied it, maybe from academia or from other areas, from art, and I think he brought a real level of respectability that, like I said, these traditions already inherently have, but it was not recognized by outsiders. And I think when they encounter Neville Drury's work, uh, he has such a huge respect and uh, passion for the subject that it really comes across to the reader. And and that's one of the things I really appreciate about what he did, because he was able to take a subject so seriously, and the practitioners so seriously, even when others in the media weren't able to.
You know, that kind of intense scholarship really does lend that weight to something, and I was especially gratified to see that Austin Osman Spare was one of his, one of the things he dedicated himself to, because Spare was so important to the chaos magic current, and perceived and perhaps probably some truth to chaos magic has so few real scholars to kind of to help them out in that elevating the perception of the path. So I really appreciate that.
Well, and I think sometimes particularly in our belief paths, we get a lot of people who are viewed as a little bit on the crazy side, and they play up on that. And it's very important to have people who can add a sense of legitimacy to the work that they're doing.
Yeah, I agree, and I know this is like an issue within esotericism because there's a real tension, I think, around the ideas of lineage and lore and the mythology of the esoteric current. And it's very easy for people to sort of buy into a mentality that views it all as a game, that they're playing a game, and that's the type of game that they enjoy, and that's well and good for people who want to do that. But there's other people who take it far more seriously, and they I don't think they can really reconcile that other point of view.
Other interviews that stick out to you now?
Sure. Well, another one recent interview that really stands out is Vincent Bridges. He was probably the foremost scholar on Sir Edward Kelly. He was, I would say, somewhat of an authority on Enochian magic and alchemy. He lived in Prague and was working as part of an alchemy museum and restoring Kelly's last known residence in Prague, and he passed away over the summer unexpectedly. So it was a real thrill to be able to talk with him before he passed, and that interview certainly stands out because there's very few people I've talked to who are so well versed in magical practice and the research behind it, and he was certainly one of those people, and he was very impressive to me in that respect. I mean, I talked to a lot of people who have tried different aspects of Enochian magic, but I've only talked with 2 people who've ever actually done the entire system from start to finish, and he was one of them. And yeah, it definitely showed in his work.
And there again, you have that kind of elevation of not only the practice, but a guy like Edward Kelly, who is generally viewed in history as a scoundrel at the very least. And I remember that interview and him having evidence, that Kelly was a soldier and that Kelly, may have not been lying about a lot of his past and actually had the credibility to work with John Dee. I think a lot of people kind of, okay, so yeah, John Dee and Edward Kelly, they had their friction, but everyone agrees that John Dee was a genius. Why would he tolerate hanging around with someone who wasn't close to his level for so long? It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've heard this so many times. People have saying, "Oh, Kelly was a fraud." I'm like, well, what's your definition of a fraud? I mean, this magical system was not produced by John Dee himself. Even John Dee admits that in his diaries. So, to me, Edward Kelly is like many figures in the history of esotericism, is much maligned, and there's the evidence used to disparage his character is, I don't think, very solid, in all honesty. It reminds me very much of that Aleister Crowley lecture on, I forget, Gilles de Rais, the French alchemist who supposedly murdered all these children, and how Crowley is very quick to point out how, anyone who's disliked by the authorities is, painted with this brush that, they're either a murderer or some sort of heretic, or they've got some other terrible character flaws, and it's pretty much par for the course. So I guess we shouldn't be surprised that Kelly is so maligned in history.
Crowley would be one to know, having been.
Yeah.
Well, we enmify those that we don't like what they're saying, and so if we can ruin their personal reputation, then we try to ruin them professionally so that people won't take them seriously. And that's a lot of what we have seen go on in history.
Certainly. And I think there's also other issues that sort of complicate this, like in the past, alchemists, I think, would intentionally make themselves out to seem like they were fraudulent, because if they were seen as legitimately able to transmute metals, their lives would be quite in danger. So we did not in West, and certainly in Europe, we did not have a situation in the past where people could be open in any real way about any kind of esoteric achievements or attainments, the way they are in Asia or Islamic lands, or other places on the planet. And that's just the way society was. So I think it kind of contributes to this seeing esoteric figures in a negative light. Not all of them, but certainly a good number of them.
I think that also perhaps there may be a legitimate path there for that kind of someone who walks into the shadow, walks against the culture, almost equated to something like the drunken master, that you need to have to be so far outside the norm that that's the only way to start these kind of perceptions.
I think so. I mean, Crowley was pretty clear about that when he, wrote about the idea that, every word is going to be misinterpreted, and he'll be cast as a villain, and his teachings will be reviled, and all of these things, because either people are willfully misunderstanding them, or they simply can't grasp them, or their religious doctrine won't let them see through the obscuration. And I think that happens with any kind of serious teaching that challenges people's preconceptions. I mean, you could argue that the coming of Buddhism or the coming of Christianity would probably, treated in similar manners by the ruling authorities. So I would say anyone who challenges the mainstream and challenges people's own ideas about themselves is going to face scrutiny, and probably a lot worse.
In cultures, someone who is a shadow walker, when they come into contact with much of the rest of the tribe, they have to walk backward, and they have to announce by their actions that they are shadow walkers, because people perceive them as dangerous.
That's true. They are dangerous.
Ostracism is so often a part of being the shaman. Even to the Zulu with their holy men being struck by lightning, no one wanted them around in case the lightning came again.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, I think anyone who is certainly like an esoteric teacher of any worth is, going to be some sort of a liminal figure, and they're going to call people out of their comfort zone and into the borderlands, the wilds of their consciousness. And it is dangerous, and it is dark, and there be dragons there.
And possibly dungeons.
Yep.
You always got to go into the cave. Before we leave the subject, you want pick us a third one of someone that may have particularly moved you or you learned a lot from.
Wow, it'd be hard to pick someone who I didn't learn a lot from. I think I think probably one of the people who was really kind of influential a while ago was David Chaim Smith. He's an artist and Kabbalist, and he's written a few books. But his artwork is very esoteric, and I think one of the things I really learned a lot from him was not getting too caught up in things like grade systems or specific practices or specific modes of teaching or things. And he used to try to simplify everything down to its most essential level. So, I would ask him things about like, well, what about the Rosicrucian grade system on the Tree of Life? And he would say, well, to me, there's only 3 grades. And he said, if you want to be real about it, there's only 2. He's like, are you awake or not? you know? And he would also, I think, in a what could be kind of perceived as a somewhat of a nihilistic type of outlook. His whole idea was like there is nothing but the ultimate, right? Ein Sof is all there is. Like everything is a manifestation of Ein Sof, or the no thing of the Kabbalists, right? So he would try to say things like, well, if you're doing some kind of angelic evocation, you've kind of already lost the game because there is no angel and there is no you. It's just Ein Sof, and that's all there is. So it was really interesting to talk with him because he was so far outside the normal, everyday paradigm that it was like a glimpse into a different reality.
Hey, have you ever talked to someone who was really outside of the occult community, who really didn't practice but had so much knowledge on a particular subject that you need to bring them on anyway?
That's a good question. You could probably categorize Jocelyn Godwin that way. I interviewed him a few years ago after he had written a book with Guido Mino de Sospiro called The Forbidden Book. And Jocelyn Godwin, for people who don't know, is a academic professor of Western esotericism and musicology at Colgate University in upstate New York. And he is amazingly knowledgeable about Western esotericism, but as far as I know, he does not practice. But I think that gets into a kind of a gray area because, like, I know there's a lot of people who are members of things like, for instance, the Theosophical Society, right? And they don't maybe have like an individual practice per se, but that doesn't mean they're not a theosophist. You know what I mean? So,
and they're still in the current. They're
yeah,
still in that magic occult current.
yeah. And I would say he took pains to distance himself from being in the midst of the tradition or traditions, but he's so knowledgeable about them. I mean, he's more knowledgeable about them than 99% of the people in the tradition. So you could say that he's not a dabbler, but those distinctions really melt away from me pretty quickly, especially when I've met so many academics who study these subjects who are heavily involved in practicing them at the same time, although they don't really publicize it. I think I bet it's more than half of them are involved in some tradition.
Now, just to move away, a break from the podcast a little bit, I know that you do a lot of work in the Salem area. I've heard you've done classes, and also, aren't you involved in a magic and art festival that's there?
Well, I've presented a couple times at the Occult Arts Salem Festival, which is going to be in its third year this September, which is a wonderful festival highlighting the intersection between magic and art. It's put together by April Shaley and Sarah Jezebel Wood. They're the two primary organizers. And they bring in artists and presenters from all over to present their artwork and talk about magic or mysticism or some related topic, to make a big weekend out of it. And last time, or actually both times they've concluded the festival with a Gnostic Mass, so that was pretty interesting. And it's really a great event, and I'm thrilled it's going to be happening again this September.
Would you say that yourself as an alchemist and how much art is a product of alchemy with the beautiful ciphers that have been produced? Is art a big part of your practice?
That's a good question. I guess art is a big part of my practice. Well, I'm heavily into tarot symbolism and using tarot as a meditative aid. I am fascinated by the old alchemical engravings. I have many, many books with them that I've sat and, I don't know if you could say studied or contemplated, because the fact is that once I open the book, I just kind of get drawn into it and time sort of slips away. I don't know if I'm actually doing anything on a intentional level other than appreciating the art, but I love the way that the symbolic artwork speaks to me on a level beyond words and takes me to a place inside myself that feels familiar and also sort of has that allure of the mysterious. And it just has a way of opening up my consciousness that is difficult to describe. Esoteric artwork, I think, is inseparable from magical tradition, because many times I think practitioners feel the need to create once they've tapped into themselves, or whatever you want to call it. The act of creation is a natural follow-up to whatever they're doing, whether it's writing, artwork, music, sculpture, whatever it is, but to create something which embodies, their experience in some respect is important way to earth, whatever they've done, I think.
It's almost been a bane to me. I try to limit myself to writing. That's the art that I'm good at. But I don't think any practitioner gets out of, hands-on arts and crafts at some point. You have to make something as a part of your practice in order for that just to feel like you're in the tradition.
Well, it's the step after the word. Creation comes after the word is spoken, and so it's a natural outflow of that. But you said that you like to use tarot. Is there a particular deck that you like, or?
Well, I started out with the Boda deck from Paul Case, which is just the major arcana, because I was heavily into Case and his tarot book and learning about the major arcana and the symbolism. And then from there, I sort of moved to the Thoth deck, which I use primarily now. Um, but there's a few other decks which I really really love. I love the Manly Hall Augustus Knapp deck that was recently reissued, because it has like a whole set of symbols that it uses that I've not found in any other tarot deck, and I don't use it for divination or to study, but it's just I can appreciate what they did with it. Um, One of the reasons I really stuck with the Thoth deck at this point is because all of the correspondences make sense to me. And for a long time, I struggled with, different tarot decks or different systems had different correspondences, and um, I wasn't really able to reconcile that for a long time, and now I basically come to the conclusion that you really just have to pick something that works for you and stick with it, and that's pretty much where I'm at. So I am fully aware and acknowledge that there are alternate correspondences and systems that work successfully using them, but that doesn't mean that it's right for me. So and that's kind of what I advocate. If it works for you, there's a reason it works, and you shouldn't look elsewhere for something else that works if what you've got is already working. And if it's not working, you need to find something that does. So I think that's a real issue in the Western systems, because you have basic correspondence systems, but a lot of them have little nuances where they just completely disagree with each other, and I think that's interesting and can be problematic. Maybe it's just one of those another guardian at the threshold, probably.
Yeah, so much of it has to be personal that there's some things you just can't learn from others, I think. Um, so speaking of that web of correspondences, I come from a chaos magic tradition, so it's kind of like there's times that chaos magicians sort of almost deride the heavy correspondence systems as being too obtuse, too stretched out,
Hmm.
too much. But so what you're saying, I think, is that you find that working with the correspondences, just playing with them in your mind, is what you're using to reach those altered states of consciousness?
I think that's one of those things. I think the correspondences are incredibly useful for a, providing a way of thinking about things and connecting things that would not otherwise be connected. And in that way, one can make magic work, because we can then begin to perceive how these disparate things we see as separate are really not separate from one another anymore. Um, yeah, I don't know if I really want to say any more about that, but I think it's useful to have a system where you can use correspondences, because it certainly allows for composition of magical rituals, creation of talismans, uh, and probably many many other things that I haven't even thought about.
Um, are there any other festivals that you do or workshops that you do where you're at?
I've done a few classes recently at the Hermetic Arts Learning Center, which is run by David Newman, which is also in Salem, Massachusetts, and he's got a great program where he brings in teachers. Aside from the classes he teaches himself, he's a very accomplished Golden Dawn magician. But he brings in other people to teach classes, and I've taught the Inner Alchemy class and Intro to Inner Alchemy. I've taught a class on Atlantis. another class on alchemy in colonial New England, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, I also did a lecture on the Rosicrucian tendencies of the early settlers in Pennsylvania, because that was an area I found really, really fascinating and often overlooked groups of settlers who, in many ways, I think are even more our magical uh, forefathers than the Golden Dawn ever was.
We've mentioned inner alchemy a few times in passing now. You think you could give our listeners a more vivid description of what that is?
Sure. So inner alchemy is basically a set of practices that use ritual and meditation and breathing exercises, along with the metaphor of laboratory alchemy, to compare the practice and the physiological effects to laboratory work. So, like the idea of your diaphragm, working your abdomen to draw air in and out of your lungs would be analogous to the bellows, of the furnace pumping air in and out of the fire. And there's many other of those type of metaphors that are employed in this practice, but the general idea of it is using ritual, meditation, and breathing to purify the individual on a mental, emotional, spiritual, physical, and psychic level, and then begin to basically alter the blood chemistry. And the goal is really not it's not psychological. It's really like enlightenment or illumination, or that peak experience is the goal of the practice. So it involves working with the inner fire, or what in the East is called the Kundalini energy. And there's a lot of what I would say are superficially simple and deceptively easy things to do that make this whole process possible. But it is a somewhat of a rigorous practice. It's daily, and it involves waking up at sunrise every day, no breaks, and doing a ritual and meditation and solar adorations and prayers, and that's kind of repeated throughout the day. And it basically becomes a lifestyle.
So many traditions that do that. Get up with the sun. I think one of the reasons I read about with the sun eaters, where they're actual physicians, studying these guys, and they can survive on just a tiny bit of food and rest. And one of their things is just get up every morning and be barefoot and take in the sun.
Ancient cultures have studied and practiced these things for thousands of years, possibly a lot longer than that. And we discount their expertise at our peril, I think. Much of this stuff is not recognized really by mainstream Western science, but the esoteric sciences are very clear. This solar energy is the same energy we're working with in our body. If you want to amplify it, the best way to do that is to get up with the sun and to do your meditation with the sunrise and absorb as much of that energy as you can every morning, and your body will begin to, I don't know to say collect it, but that's kind of what happens.
Well, anybody who has SADS the sunlight deficiency thing, particularly going on in the wintertime, they know that that's truth. And that's truth because even if you plaster yourself up against the window where the sunshine is coming in, you automatically feel more energetic.
Yeah.
Kind of tracking back a little to something you said about ancient cultures, and also one of the reasons why I asked this an earlier question about people who are not in the occult who inform occult practice, I think are hugely important. One of the people who informed me is the anthropologist Wade Davis, who is famous for saying just because another culture perceives or is another expression of humanity and it's not part of this huge technological monster that we've created, it doesn't make them any lesser.
Certainly not.
Do you find it useful to look for shamanic roots in what you practice or just what you read about?
I'm not really. I think I know what you're asking, but I'm not really positive. When you say shamanic roots, do you mean like Siberian shamans or Native American shamans or?
I would say that anything hunter-gatherer or close to hunter-gatherer societies.
Tribal.
Yeah.
Um, let's see. I would say yes with the caveat that I don't actually believe that I have any way to recover the wisdom of those cultures because they didn't, as far as I'm aware, leave anything that I could perceive without intuition alone. But what they did leave, aside from the stone megaliths, are some artwork. And the one image that really, I think, informs me most from that realm is the Cernunnos image, especially the one from the Gundestrup cauldron of the Celts. And I've studied this image a lot, and the only way that I have to analyze it is by using the symbolism I know from Baphomet or the Horned God or the Devil in the Tarot, and sort of retroactively applying that to this Horned God figure who I see all of the same attributes displayed on the Gundestrup cauldron as I do in the Baphomet Eliphas Levi drawing. And I don't know, I wouldn't say that's like a proper way of interpreting the symbolism, but it's the only way I have. And I feel like, to me, that's certainly could be considered a shamanic culture, and that image, without a doubt, informs me and my practice and philosophy, yeah.
It's the amazing thing about a lot of occult things is that you see so many times where these symbols are so obviously being repeated in separate places, in separate cultures, separate people who there's no comprehensible way that they could have had contact, and yet.
Well, I would actually argue that I think there is actually ways that they could have had contact, and I think that it's possible, although I'm no expert, but I think it's possible that people in the ancient world traveled a lot more than we might assume, and that people were aware of other cultures more than we might think they were.
Well, I absolutely agree about ancient travel being much more common, but I think I'm more on just people who are not only separated by distance but by time. And
Well, I mean, I don't disagree. I think it's a real huge question. We could say that people because they're human beings, they naturally kind of arrive at similar type of ideas, even though they may be in different places or at different times. But there's also the idea of a sort of progenitor culture that sort of disseminated all these things all over the earth, and before it vanished itself. And there's plenty of evidence for that as well.
Interesting. Look, we're going to have to. You have to suggest a podcast of yours. Of course, you're talking on an Atlantis type sort of theory.
Certainly, the Atlantis theory, or you could even call it Sophia Perennis, the perennial tradition, or you could even look at it like from the traditionalist philosophical school, that there's a primordial religion that was, straight from the divine, and what we have today are just adumbrations of it. But yeah, I don't know that I've actually done an interview with anyone about Atlantis, but I've taught a class on it, and I have a lot of ideas about Atlantis and the meanings that we could ascribe to it, which I think are multi-layered, because I don't believe someone like Plato would have approached the subject if it was just a historical tale.
Yeah, that once again, why would someone who's obviously a genius spread fairy tales? It doesn't make any sense. We're coming up on the hour mark here, believe it or not. Either you said your calendar is booked. Are there any interviews, or not even? It doesn't have to be interviews. Anything you're really looking forward to here in the near future that we're gonna listen to, or you're gonna participate in?
Well, there's a number of recordings I've got in the queue that I'm just working on getting out. Some of the ones I'm very excited about, we have a recording of the Voices of Modern Gnosticism panel discussion that took place last November in Arlington, Massachusetts, with representatives of 3 different Gnostic churches. I have an interview coming up with Craig Williams, the author of Cave of the Numinous, who was one of the participants in that Voices of Modern Gnosticism panel discussion. I have an interview coming up with Angel Miller, who I just released an interview with recently. I have another one because he's got a new book coming out, The Crescent and the Compass, about the intersections between Islam, Freemasonry, and revolution in the modern era, which is a fascinating book, I think. If you're interested in esotericism and politics, and there were so many surprises in the book that when I was done with it, I didn't actually think of the Middle East and Islam in the same way that I had before. So that was really interesting. And I also want to mention I have an interview coming up with Carl Abrahamson, who is a wonderful author, and I'm really excited about that too.
What kind of stuff does he write?
He had a book come out recently from Scarlet Imprint called Resonances, which is a series of essays over, I think, a decade or more, which are really, really interesting and thought-provoking essays. He's also the editor of the Fenris Wolf Journal, which is published, I think, annually, and quite a large format journal with many, many articles and essays from many people. And I think he's also written some fiction, as well as done some music with Genesis P. Orridge, formerly of Psychic Youth fame.
Colleen, once again, I have hogged the conversation. Is there anything that you have been dying to ask that you can't get word in?
No. I've had several thoughts, and I've been introduced to some new authors and things tonight that I'm going to have to be looking up. Looking forward to starting to follow your podcast because I didn't know about it beforehand. And, I'm just kind of still in the end of, hopefully the end of this downtime I've been going through.
Yeah. And see, podcasts are perfect for when you're not feeling up to doing a whole lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I broke my leg a couple of months ago. I broke my femur in half, and
I'm sorry to hear that.
No, it's all part of the experience.
That's for sure.
What she doesn't say is she broke the femur on the leg, the top part of the leg that she's already missing the bottom half of. So.
Oh boy.
Yeah, my prosthesis was stronger than my bone, so it was the bone that snapped instead of my artificial leg.
Oh boy.
So it's been an adventure.
Well, hopefully you're recovering from that.
I am very well. Had a lot of good support.
Good.
And insights.
And insights, yes.
Just like anything that pain informs, spirituality sometimes.
It does, and it gives us a better perspective. I have been an impatient person most of my life, and this time around, I have not had a problem following the doctor's orders and being patient about things and waiting for time rather than pushing the envelope. That's a new experience for me.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, to me, those type of things are the real test of, whether this stuff works or not. Does it make you able to handle that better or not? Does it prepare people for death or not?
Does it give us a place of peace?
Yeah, and I think the thing is, if you do the work, it does all that it promises. And I don't think I'd invest this much time and energy doing the podcast or reading all these books or waking up every morning so early or whatever if this stuff didn't work. I was a much less happy, fulfilled person before I began down this path, and it's not an easy road for sure, but it is definitely made life more worth living.
I would even say when I first started in my path that I was such an idiot and a bonehead that, I would read all of this, so much of this stuff is healing, healing, healing. I'm like, why is there all this healing? And it took me the longest time to realize why that was the important part.
He was a bonehead. He really was.
Well, I don't think it's just you. I mean, I would argue that, more people than not don't think of healing as even part of what's being done with this stuff. It certainly doesn't seem like it to a lot of people I talk with. The people who know what they're doing and understand it and have been around, they get it. But a lot of people, I think, are, especially when they first come to this stuff, are, I think, captivated by ideas of rising through the grades or attaining some degree or initiation, or that that something outside of themselves is going to empower them. Until they learn that it's not about that at all.
And if we approach them with the idea of healing, very often they think that the reason for practicing magic is to change others, to make others better, to heal others, without thinking that it's really only ourselves that we can change.
Not only that, but I think anyone who assumes that other people need healing more than they themselves do is probably got a lot of preconceptions to work out.
I was going to say an ignorant ass, but
yeah,
yes.
that's a good
I'm
word.
still working on that.
And we all are. That's the thing. I mean, even those who think they're not, we're still. I think we're all still working on that to some extent.
Yeah, I've got the healing part, but I'm always so focused on other people that, physician heal thyself tends to fall by the wayside.
The wiser I get, the more I know I don't know.
That's the truth.
Greg, thank you so very much for coming on. Is there anything else you want to promote while we have you?
Well, I just want to say again, thank you, James and Colleen. It's really a pleasure to be on the show. I really appreciate the invitation. And the website is occultofpersonality.net. Got a lot of great interviews up there for free that people can listen to. It's on iTunes. It's on Stitcher Radio. And if you like the show, please consider signing up for the membership section. It's relatively inexpensive, but it makes a world of difference to me because it means that I can actually create the show and continue doing it for free, which I love and I think the listeners love. And I hope, and it's my mission to make sure that it's a worthwhile podcast and it's worth people's time. If they're interested in Western esotericism, I think they'll enjoy it. And there's not much fluff, but there's a lot of good content there.
Absolutely. And donate and go listen to Occult of Personality, because there are really so few occult podcasts that are so well produced, and not like us that have nasty humming and fans in the background.
Dogs barking.
No, don't. Yeah, no, it's. I mean, I'm thrilled you guys are doing this too. I mean, you're right. There's so very few podcasts, and especially now that podcasts are actually like starting to be a happening thing. I would hope there'd be more, but there will be, I think, at some point.
There will. Hey, so to our listeners out there, come to the website, scrollwiththoth.com. We'll have show notes on there. Link to some of the episodes of Occult of Personality that we mentioned. Of course, occultofpersonality.net. You can donate to us through our PayPal button. We don't have a cool membership section because I am not that dedicated to create extra content. We should probably do that someday. We also have our Amazon search window. Type something in there, get a few pennies our way. You can also connect with me, scrollwiththoth.tumblr.com.
You can find me on Facebook at Colleen Kelly.
Greg, you and phones going off were horrible. Do you have any kind of social media that you engage with people in?
Yeah, we have a Twitter page. Just search for Occult of Personality. We also have the Facebook page, Occult of Personality, Google Plus page. I think that's probably it. But, I'd love to hear from people if you want to send me a message or get in touch on Twitter or Facebook or Google Plus or send me an email. Or I love to chat with people. If you have questions or comments or whatever, just get in touch, and I'd love to hear from you.
All right. You have a wonderful night, and we hope to hear from you again soon.
Yeah, you guys too. Thank you again. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Take care.